So we were beginning to develop down there quite a team of people who were there. So the premises seemed to be lived in, seemed to be open, seemed to be saying, 7 whole days, not 1 in 7. And there was beginning to be a sense that the thing was humming. Looking back, I suppose one of the best pieces of work and ministry that we did, again, often it's just reacting to things that come up. Well, it is what we call the church house at 79 Park Lane. Now, again, this was our friend Tim Coleman and myself, I think, can sort of share the blame or the honour for it. Tim remembered how when the house next door to the church came on the market years before for about £2,000 or £3,000 at the time, he was very keen that the church should purchase it for a caretaker's house. And that would secure also the fourth side of with 3 sides onto the road, as it were, but the fourth side of our buildings for future extension if required. And it would be very useful to have, he thought, a caretaker there. And he hadn't been able to persuade the trustees at the time that it was a good move. So in the meantime, the house had been a set of bed sits, probably 7 or 8 bed sits, but it had been very run down and neglected, and it became on the market. And of course this is in a bed sit area, and I had been concerned that we should really relate, if we could, to the students living there and also the young people, often very lonely in the city, in bed sit land, which is just coming up from the city up to as far as Park Lane. A lot of large houses being made, and in Park Lane itself some large houses being made into bed sits, and the one right next to the church. So that when it came on the market and Tim Coleman said, see that the house is on the market again, what about that for a caretaker's house? I said, well, my thought, Tim, is that really it's set up for bed sits. We ought to be trying to do something that some Methodist students and some young people in the city who we could help. Surely we ought to do it as a community house rather than a caretaker's house, because the trouble with the caretaker's house is you get a caretaker in, you don't want to sack the caretaker because he's no good, you can't, and he's in there, and that's it. And there's no income coming in, and there's a real difficult situation. Tim immediately was quick enough to see that for what it was and said, fine. He was more concerned, as he had been previously, to see the possibilities and potential, I suppose, as a businessman and a Christian businessman, for the future for Park Lane, it as an investment, and also to secure the possibility if we wanted to develop our buildings at Park Lane, if we had a land at that side. So he was very much keen on it as a business transaction that was good for the church. I was very keen on the idea because I could see its potential in terms of the kind of work we wanted to do amongst young people, and together we could see that we ought to float the idea. Of course it had to be done very quickly, and so Tim and I looked at the possibility of getting people to give interest-free loans towards buying it, and that we might have a mortgage as well. And we actually drew up a hit list of about 20 names of people we thought we ought to approach, and he had the 10 that he thought he had most influence with, and I had the 10 that the other 10, shall we say, and a series of phone calls. We, at the end of 3 or 4 days, said how we're getting on, and it was clear that between us we probably had got quite a lot of interest in giving interest-free loans. The property is very run down, and we're just thinking now about it's only, what, 6, 7 years ago? 8.
1982.
1982 we bought it, yes, so 7 years ago, and the property was valued at £25,000. There was 7 bed sits with wash basins in each room and storage heaters. Terrible condition, but it was there, and a large property, and next right cheek by jowl with the church. And so once we'd realised that we could get sufficient interest-free loans, we put it at the church, and the church itself was persuaded to put £2,000 of its own money into it. And we bought it. What an act of faith, if you think about it, to do that. And I'm sure it wouldn't have happened but for the fact that Tim was so well respected and was known to be an astute businessman and a fine Christian leader, and he carried the day for us. But I do think it's been the best piece of work possibly that we've done. The value, I suppose, of the property now, it must be 80 or 90,000, I don't know. But that isn't the point. I'd always said at the time that although for 5 years we'd have to do this, because we got development grants immediately, 90% development grants for the city to do it up. It's been completely renovated, put in excellent condition, and has been a home for some of the Methstock students that have worked within the church, one or two of our own members' children who needed to be finding their own feet in their own accommodation, and indeed a number of other people who perhaps were in social need, as well as people just coming to the city who we heard of through Methodism or elsewhere, who needed a flat. And we felt through this we would get a number of people who also would help in the ongoing work of the church and be part of a community, and that has been the case on and off. Really, we guessed that we would have problems with one or two tenants, about whether they would ever leave or whatever if they were not good tenants. But the experience has been it's been far less problem than we ever thought it would be in terms of the personnel. And some very fine people have come through there and have joined in the life of the church. I had said at the time, well, looking at the age of our congregation, looking into the future, maybe in 20 years, 25 years' time, we shall be down to such a small group of people that we shall need to get the income that will come from that house once the mortgage is paid off to help pay the way of the church continuing. And there's always a long stop that after we'd got over the period when we used the development grant, the 5-year period, we could sell it, and that would also help the ongoing work of the church financially. So I'm glad to know that it's still going forward as a viable community house. But it's always in the long shot, when that has been done, and a good piece of work has been done for a series of young people in the city, that we shall at the end of the day be able, if we need to develop in another way with the monies that would accrue. All of this had happened in the first 5 years that I was here, from 78 to 83. And I'd come from a mission circuit in downtown Northern City, feeling that, okay, for 5 years while the children were growing into their teens, we would come into a nicer situation perhaps for them to grow up in. But that at the end of that time we would move back into city mission work. So I was expecting to be here for 5 years and not wanting to do more than that. But it's quite obvious through the fact that the children were enjoying the life they were living there, didn't want to be disrupted, and also that my wife was in full-time employment usefully in a local school, that we had to reconsider the idea of a short ministry and maybe would stay longer. But I honestly felt, well, okay, if we go on for 1 more year, the first thing I said, then 2 more to make the 8, that I thought the best work had been done. We couldn't, we'd really done the job that we set out to do, and that we ought to go. And it was at this time that I was persuaded by Dr. John Vincent that it was a time perhaps to tackle Doctorate of Ministry, which he ran as the British section of a United States seminary, New York Theological Seminary, and was always touting for people to join the next course so that it'd have enough people to keep it going. And I joined a course, and there were 8 people on it from various parts of the country in various denominations. And it seemed to me that this would be something I could do when I felt the main work that was going to do at Park Lane had been done, and that I ought to, as the middle of my ministry, to spend some time reflecting upon it and to do some study and research. But of course what I discovered that the D-Min was meant to be very practical as well as research, and not just one on your own, but collegial with other people, and preferably with the other people within your local church situation. So in fact what developed for us the 3 most fruitful years possibly of one's ministry here, by actually looking at what we had done and what we hadn't done and what we perhaps ought to do, and trying to find out what the real problem was at that stage to tackle as a local group of church people, and to research it and to research around it and to do some new piece of ministry, and then to write it up and possibly at the end of the day get a doctorate of ministry. And that's in fact what happened, surprise, surprise. And it only happened because some of the finest people you could wish to work with, who are members of the local church, were willing to be what's called the site team, and spend a Sunday evening fortnightly for nearly 3 years, 2 years or more, working on this project with me. And it was very fruitful because we had to do a lot of study together and also think out what was required in the local situation, a problem to be tackled. And in the end, of course, we realised that the thing that needed tackling after many false starts was to relook at the whole community church ideal, to see how certain things had failed because we'd, provided rooms, provided things, but hadn't really thought out a whole community development approach to them, so that we weren't just providing, but we were actually engaging the local people in trying to see what was needed and trying to relate the whole of the church, the upstairs church, which met for worship on Sunday, with the downstairs work for mainly midweek and mainly in the local community. Consequently, my thesis in the end was called Upstairs, Downstairs, how to relate a church and community on the same premises. And that did really give us a chance to look at it theoretically and analytically and really try and make it something which was so embedded in the psyche and the structures of the church that it meant that another ministry could come along and consolidate that was the word we used a lot, consolidate this new role of Park Lane as a neighbourhood church, indeed as a community church. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity those last 3 years provided. Of course, what happened is, as you stay longer, you get to do more and more work, and that on top of it, we're quite glad, I suppose, at the end of the time, although perhaps we'd like to have even stayed longer, that you do need, through the itinerant system, fortunately, through the itinerant system, you are able to move on and pull all the irons out of the fire and possibly recuperate a little bit before you get them all in somewhere else. One of the features of any ministry is births, marriages and deaths, I suppose, and though I was clearly a disturber in terms of the sermons preached, particularly the last couple of years when I suppose I got a bit demob happy knowing I was leaving, and therefore was not so constrained in what I was saying in the implications of the faith. The curious thing is the work with those outside in terms of pastoral care of people who come to church as young people wanting to be married there but not devout in any kind of way. Perhaps the only link perhaps we often have with the working class people, in fact, by and large, I'm afraid to say. Provided, I always think, and always does provide a Methodist minister with an earthing of his ministry. And I usually found that these couples who came with great fear and trembling to speak to you, to ask whether they'd be married there, expecting some kind of pious, otherworldly person who would ask them all sorts of very difficult questions and who they'd feel very uncomfortable with. And I'd like to set people at their ease, so I usually said, well, yes, I consider marrying you, but, you know, it's got to be last one's at 2 o'clock during the season, you see. Of course, I always go and watch Norwich 3 o'clock Carrow Road, you see. And they would sort of, usually you found people, if you didn't say this to everybody, but you could guess the kind of person you would say this with, and they would feel a lot relieved that here was someone who was willing to talk about football or something else, as well as the most serious things that they were going to be involved in, that is, pledging themselves for life to each other in church. But, of course, there are curious stories that one could write a book about this. I mean, we did in fact have 2 people turn up at the same time, and I've thanked Bert Adcock, our marvellous caretaker, who did his job cheerfully for nothing, or more or less nothing. And he helped me out on this occasion. You can just imagine how at 12 o'clock, when 2 groups had arrived, and the cameraman had said that they would come here, 2 cameramen, and I'd sent one of them away down to St Thomas's, who we got the wrong church. But as the 2 lots of in-laws looked across the aisle and began to think, well, I don't know any of these people there, suddenly realised that we'd actually got 2 different weddings at the same time. So we ushered one lot out and into the hall where Bert kept them happy in the school hall while we did the other one. Now, in all these situations, I'm very fortunate and I tend to land on my feet. I don't know how I get the luck. Because in this case, both the bride and the groom were late because the bride was coming from east on the A47, and the bridegroom was coming from west on the A47. It was during the height of the summer holiday season, and there were such queues on both roads. They were late, quarter of an hour late each. So that decided which wedding we should do first, and we told Bert to look after them when they arrived. They would know that they could come in from the side door as the others left for their photographs at the front of the church. And that was how we got rid of that one, successfully. But the worst experience I had, I think, and the people came back with their child a year later for baptism and said they'd been retelling the story, and I said, so had I since. Was the story of two couples on a certain infamous day at the end of August, beginning of September time, in other words, beginning of a football season. The first of these couples came to see me, I suppose it would be in April or May, and said, could I possibly marry them on a certain date, end of August? And I immediately said with the script, well, the fixture list hasn't come out yet, we might have Liverpool at home, you never know, or Man United. And they laughed and said, oh well, it's okay. So I said, what time of day do you want it? Because last one said, oh, we want it late in the afternoon. I said, oh, well, you better have it after the match at 5 o'clock. Fine, that's what we'd like to have. We'd like to have it at 5 o'clock, I said. So I said, right, okay. Because when they came to see me the second time, for the second interview, I said, you wouldn't believe it, would you? But we have actually got Liverpool at home that day, so I'm glad you're doing it at 5. So that was just a start. And you might say it's funny, but another couple came to see me and said, we'd like our wedding on that day. I said, well, I've got a problem for you, really, because I've got one at 5 o'clock and I'm not doing them before then. I said, well, we want ours late in the afternoon. Can we have it at 6? I said, oh, well, that's fine. Have it at 6, yes. And I agreed to do this at 6 o'clock for the second couple. A few weeks later, I had a phone call, and this is unbelievable, really, because of the coincidence. I had a phone call from the registry office. And the registrar said, I've got two couples in here to see me about a wedding that you're doing on a certain day. Now that those two couples should actually arrive at the registrar's office to see about their wedding, that were going to be the two that I'd said at 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And the registrar said, but you can't do that because the law says that you must do weddings before 6 p.m. So I said, oh dear, that's very difficult because I don't want to do them early in the day and I've promised one at 5. Well, they both want it late in the day. I said, well, look, put them on the line and I'll have a word with them. And the second lot said, look, can we have it at 5:30? I said, well, there's not really time. They've got to come at 5. Unless you're prepared to wait in the other hall and come through when they've gone out, just as the previous couple done. They said, fine, well, we don't mind about that. We'd far rather it be at 5:30. But I said, but you must be there on time, because if you're not, and we don't get the words beforehand, then in fact it's invalid. And then the registrar came back to me and said, I've heard what you've been saying, and I may even come and check up. You must do it beforehand. I said, fine, we'll do it beforehand, don't we? And then when the day arrived, we had friends to stay, and my son David and I were going with a friend's husband, Chris's friend's husband and his son, to stand on the terrace and watch the match. Fine. And off we went down to the match, and it was a really warm day, so we went in open neck shirt and slacks, and that was it. And we got on the terraces there, and we watched the match. And of course my idea was that I would leave at 4:30 or 4:25, drive home, and then change and be ready to be there at 5 o'clock for the wedding, having suitably filled in the registers beforehand, the 5 o'clock and the 5:30 wedding. It's a long story, a shaggy dog story. So at about 4:25, when the game was 3/4 over and very exciting, I hardly wanted to leave, I began to say, right, well, I must go now. Just as I left them, I said, oh, but you'll need to get in when you get home. You better have my key. And I gave it to David and went off. As I was driving home, I suddenly realised, of course, if there's no one at home when I get there because the women have gone into town shopping, I will not be able to get in to change for a wedding. It was now 25 to 5, driving home in a pair of slacks and an open neck shirt. Realising I couldn't possibly go back because the time I got back the game would be over and 30,000 people would be coming out of the ground and would never find them. Had to go forward, keep my fingers crossed that all would be well. Drove into the house, no car there, finding that the place was locked up. All laid out on the bed were my gear to change into to take a wedding, and I couldn't get in. So, panic ensued. If I'd only not panicked, I might have realised that if I'd gone all round, there was a very small window open at the top of the house, which my next door neighbour, being very good with a ladder, would have probably got up to and got in. But I had no ladder, didn't even see the small window at the top there. Even got to the stage of getting a cricket bat, trying to break a window to get in, but I couldn't hit it hard enough because I hadn't the courage, I suppose, to do so. Panic then set in again. This was now between 20 and 4:45. So what could I do? So I drove down the road to your house. Fortunately, Caroline was in, and I began phoning my colleagues to see if I could borrow their clerical shirts and the rest of it. First tried Brian Dan, who was out, and eventually a superintendent minister who lives about a mile away or so, and his son was in. So I said to his son, and this is absolutely true, "Do you know where your father keeps his clerical shirts and collars and studs?" He said, yes, I think so. I said, well, I will be there in 5 minutes. Please have a shirt, collar and stud ready by the front door, period. He said, okay. Got in the car and drove round to the supers off Newmarket Road. And his son opened the door and gave me this, which I immediately put on the shirt, the collar and the studs together, with a pair of slacks I got on and nothing else, no suit. Remembering that, of course, we do keep a gown down in the vestry at Park Lane, and drove like a mad thing all the way to Park Lane, arriving at 1:05, where Ron Wade, playing the organ, was busily wondering what was happening, thinking I'd stay till the end of the match, so I'd warned him what I was going to do, and thought I'd been caught up in the crowd or whatever, and the bride and groom all ready. And I whipped through the back, put on the gown, walked out as if nothing had happened, gown over the collar and tie, shirt sleeve, all it's such a hot day, and went to the front and said, "It's all well, don't worry, just a little bit of a hiccup." And we had the wedding, but of course, starting at 5:05, we were running very close to the fact the next one had to be at 5:30. And so eventually we got the 5:05 lot out at about just after 5:30, and about 20 to 6, 5:45, we were on to the second one, wondering whether within the congregation there was a registrar duly to say it was invalid if we didn't say the words by 6 o'clock. And the second lot had been informed that there was a bit of we were running late, but they were all working together for us because we were working for them. They wanted it late, and they were getting it late, but not too late. And we carried on with the second wedding, and when they'd said all the words that were necessary to say legally, we looked at the watch and it was 2 minutes to 6, and we then had a hymn and relaxed. And here endeth the second lesson of my shaggy dog story of a wedding. One of the things that came out of the D-Min project was that we had in fact to produce a piece of ministry, an actual project. So we developed over a 10-month period a series of events in which we could engage people in the local community, people in the existing groups or new groups, and to see how there was a better understanding of what we were about at the end of the period than there was at the beginning. And I'm not sure we found there was a great improvement in just such a short period as 10 months, but we certainly were forced by this D-Min project to actually develop a programme of community action which we'd wanted to do, and which this gave us the impetus or the imperative to do, because if we were to complete the D-Min project, we had to have a programme of events. And so we also had to work together with the local community, and this meant involving a better communications within the church community centre, and also with the local neighbourhood which we seek to serve. One of these was to develop a newsletter for within to share information from each of the groups, because one of the things we found is that various groups hired rooms, but together that none of them realised the others were there or who they were. And so we extended the neighbourhood committee of the church to be a neighbourhood committee which involved all the groups there. And we invited them to share fully in the planning of the whole venture. Now, some of them didn't wish to do so. They said, look, we just want to hire a room, that's it. But others leapt at the idea of a wider involvement, and were absolutely amazed to discover who the other groups were, and that they were all from the locality, all working towards the same end. And we did discover that there was a sort of general values and aims that we could have together, which were true whether people were churchgoers or not churchgoers, whether they claimed to be atheists or claimed to be Buddhists in some cases, and claimed to be Christians or Methodists or whatever. And we did find that we could work together because we had a common aim and a common understanding that we were there to serve the needs of the neighbourhood and to elicit these needs and to work on the community development model of operating, of people participating in their own future and involvement in an ongoing development. And so the enthusiasts for this, quite a lot of the best enthusiasts for this were people who were never thinking of coming to church or coming from church, and they were thrilled to think that they were part of a thing that church was doing without the payoff being, and we expect to see you on Sunday or to convert you. And of course the church workers were involved with these, were so pleased also to work with people who didn't always want to sort of be saying, and when are we going to have a prayer or something like that, because they realised that the actual work was the prayer. Each smile a hymn, each kindly deed a prayer, as one of the hymns has it, that it was there without being spoken, and they didn't need to all the time be knee-jerking into some kind of pious exercise in order to remind themselves that what they were doing was worthwhile and Christian. And so this was a real sense of community across ideological barriers, you might say, that had been there before. Very well worthwhile. The other thing that we did, as well as developing this wider neighbourhood committee and the newsletter that kept people informed of what was going on within the place, was to try and let people in the neighbourhood know, and this was by to have a community church or community magazine. And this was to come out quarterly and to go out 2,000 copies of it to the 2,000 nearest houses and homes around the church, which was quite a big undertaking, and both to get the quality of articles and information, and also the people who were willing to shove it through people's letterbox, and also to finance it. Well, we tried to finance it by getting as many adverts as we could, and that was quite successful. And also found that, of course, a small number of people would lump their thing around and work on putting it together. But nevertheless, it was a very worthwhile exercise, and from it, some people discovered the church was there who didn't know it was there. Newcomers to the area, people would even come to the congregation or come to the women's meeting, and certainly come to the youth work, because that had dropped through their letterbox. And so it was our first move to go public, as it were. We knew what we were trying to do within the church, we knew what we were trying to do within the community on the premises, but to actually have the confidence to go outside and put through letterboxes that here we are available, not knowing what the response might be or whether it was worthwhile at all, was the first step in what I would say is going public. And then the biggest venture we made, and act of faith in a sense, was to believe that we now got to a stage where we could go even more public by actually putting on an event, not in our premises, but actually in the community. And therefore we chose Hayham Park, which was the park, obviously is the park within our neighbourhood, or just another edge of it, and to see whether we couldn't actually put on a fun day for the whole neighbourhood, so it had a sense of being a community through the community centre, but actually out there in the park, a fun day. And this was the May Day, was the day we chose for it, and it was the last year I was here that we worked towards having a May Day spectacular. And well, we were very fortunate, because most May Days have been very wet or very cold, but that was warm and dry, at least until the thing was almost over. And this was to begin with a carnival spirit of parade in fancy dress through the streets, with music and the like to bring people to their doors. And then within the park itself, a running stall of hot dogs and the rest of it, and various events as you'd expect on some kind of a carnival day. And that, I think, was one of the highlights and completion of the idea that we were not just a little thing that we had in our own mind and our own premises, but actually we were actually trying to generate a sense of community within the total neighbourhood. And I'm glad to say again, not only was it successful the first time, but it has continued to be so for 3 years since then. And so I do believe now that Park Lane is on the map as a resource for our neighbourhood. Everyone knows it's a church, so that they know that it's a Christian thing, but that we aren't trying to be dogmatic about that, but we are trying to say that we represent the man for others, and therefore we exist for those who are not our members. And I believe that ongoing wider vision must be maintained, as well as strengthening the fellowship and the faith of the membership of the church, and that together these two things, despite hiccups, will be needed for quite a long future ahead of us.